Breaking news right now. President Donald Trump just asked by a reporter if he would take information from foreign powers on his opponents in the 2020 race. Here's his new answer.
The campaign this time around, if foreigners, if Russia, if China, if someone else offers you information on an opponent, should they accept it or should they call the FBI?
I think maybe you do both. I think you might want to listen. There's nothing wrong with listening. If somebody called from a country, Norway, we have information on your opponent. Oh, I think I'd want to hear it.
You want that kind of interference in our elections?
It's not an interference. They have information. I think I'd take it.
Quite the story. I'm joined right now by phone on this breaking story by former federal prosecutor John Flannery, who's assessed many issues relating to Trump investigations, and Professor Brittany Cooper back with me. John, your reaction to the president's assertion here breaking this hour?
If there was any question of his intent before, he confirms it every day. It's so amazing that out in the open, he's telling us he would take information from a foreign government, which we could suspect tried to influence us, and if the information is passed from one country to the other to sanitize its acceptance, say Norway as he chose, instead of what, Russia, instead of Venezuela, what kind of practice is this when past presidential candidates and other candidates have been very careful not to take such information, not to rely on it, and not to move? And so I think that that's the real problem here. And it is astonishing to me that we hear these kinds of things from the White House, and we can't even get ourselves to an impeachment resolution to investigate it formally.
Right, and you're
breaking news.
You're speaking to the wider context of this, as you often do. John, stay with me. Brittany, John points out that this comes against the backdrop of the open investigations, of these contempt votes, of Hope Hicks agreeing tonight to testify, but others fighting it. And this boils down to Donald Trump and his aides. Rudy Giuliani has been big on this, basically saying, yeah, I'd do it again.
Absolutely. This is a president who has no integrity, and frankly, he has a pretty terrible knowledge of American civics. And so he doesn't think that there's any problem with the ways in which he is acting and the ways in which interference from foreign powers is fundamentally an interference with the American rule of law and with democratic institutions. The issue, though, is that he keeps on saying this to the American people like it's reasonable. And so there's a redefining of American norms such that people actually think that it's fine to just accept information from foreign governments. That's the thing that we really need to be focused on, is how do we make the compelling case that the American government needs to do something to put this president in check when he has half of the populace believing that it's okay to just accept information all willy-nilly from foreign governments.
And John, I'm getting here, this is breaking, as I say, in a very interesting interview with ABC News' George Stephanopoulos that has not even aired in full yet on television. But John, building on what Brittany was just saying, I have new parts of the transcript that I want to read to you. We don't yet have the full tape, but there's another serious claim in here, and I'm reading. Stephanopoulos makes a very important historical point and says, when Al Gore received a stolen briefing book in a different campaign, presidential, he called the FBI. And the president says in this new interview, quote, well, that's a different stolen briefing book. This is somebody that said, we have information on your opponent. Oh, let me call the FBI. Give me a break. Life doesn't work that way. And Stephanopoulos presses John and says, this is breaking news. Stephanopoulos, asking the president just now, says, well, the FBI director says that's what you have to do. And the president, according to ABC News, responds, quote, the FBI director is wrong, John.
Well, this is part of the monarchical presidency that we've been dealing with, the tendency toward despotism, toward whatever I say is the law, no matter what the law is. This is a man, the immoral man, without standards, by law, by constitution, by tradition, by common sense, by decorum. And that's what we're up against. The nation has this constitutional crisis because we have a man in the White House who has no idea what this nation is about or stands for.
I think we're going to play this sound again for folks just joining us, 6:53 p.m. on the East Coast, and it's one of those days in the news. The president obviously deciding to lean into controversy in a controversial interview with ABC News' George Stephanopoulos. As I mentioned to viewers, this hasn't even aired in full. We're getting pieces of it, and I want to play this very significant part that ABC News has released. Let's take a look.
The campaign this time around, if foreigners, if Russia, if China, if someone else offers you information on an opponent, should they accept it or should they call the FBI?
I think maybe you do both. I think you might want to listen. There's nothing wrong with listening. If somebody called from a country, Norway, we have information on your opponent. Oh, I think I'd want to hear it.
You want that kind of interference in our elections?
It's not an interference. They have information. I think I'd take it.
It's a striking assertion from a president whose investigation is still facing for these very issues, whose son, Donald Trump Jr., was in the Congress today trying to explain away some of that very behavior that Donald Trump just spoke to. And I'm joined by phone by John Flannery, as mentioned, and Maya Wiley, an attorney who knows these issues well and a former civil prosecutor. And before I go to you, Maya, take a listen to another part that we're now airing for the first time. This part has not aired yet, but it's a fuller piece of this brand new interview. Take a listen.
So should he have gone to the FBI when he got that email?
Okay, let's put yourself in a position. You're a congressman. Somebody comes up and says, hey, I have information on your opponent. Do you call the FBI? I don't think.
Coming from
I'll tell you
Russia,
what,
you do?
I've seen a lot of things over my life. I don't think in my whole life I've ever called the FBI. In my whole life. You don't call the FBI. You throw somebody out of your office. You do whatever
Al
you do.
Gore got a stolen briefing book. He called the FBI.
Well, that's different. A stolen briefing book. This isn't a stolen. This is somebody that said, we have information on your opponent. Oh, let me call the FBI. Give me a break. Life doesn't work that way.
The FBI director says that's what should happen.
The FBI director is wrong.
The FBI director is wrong. Maya Wiley, there's been much talk in these investigations about the president's authorities and whether they were abused, as described in Volume 2 of the Mueller report. Is it his call, in your view, to overrule the FBI's statement of current law regarding that obligation?
Well, he's not qualified to override the FBI statement of law. He's not an attorney, but I think more importantly, first of all, Ari, I can't leave you alone for a minute, can I?
No, apparently. News.
Apparently not. I think what's so astounding here is it's both that he, as someone who does not have a legal background, as someone who lacks foreign policy and counterintelligence experience, is once again refusing to listen to his experts in government, is one thing, and it's bad. But remember that what he's essentially saying is a foreign government like Russia or China that we actually have beef with, we have concerns about, we have national security concerns about, which this president has said regularly. If they offer me as a candidate in a U.S. presidential election information on an opponent, I'm not even going to stop and consider what their motives are. I am not going to stop and consider whether or not there is a national security concern, and I am not going to consider contacting counterintelligence officials of the United States government.
And Maya, the construction here sounds like reporting into a separate entity, the FBI, which for any normal independent candidate it would be. What does it tell you that the sitting president, who controls the executive branch, is speaking to that level of distrust? I mean, I would think that any jump ball that could go in the president's favor, within law, within reason, the FBI would be happy to keep confidential and just give some input on. And yet he seems to show a blatant distrust of his own FBI director here.
Well, and this is a pattern, right? He's undermined the morale of the FBI. He's asked his attorney general to open an investigation into the FBI. He's acted as if the FBI is less trustworthy than Putin himself, and that should be a deep concern to most Americans. But let's also remember that what he's really saying in this statement is, I will put my self-interest ahead of the country.
Right, and above the legal obligations as defined by the sitting FBI director on record. I'm thrilled to add that it's a breaking story, but a former ambassador in the Obama administration to Russia, Michael McFaul, joins us. Your reaction, sir?
Just frustration, disappointment. Again, he obviously does not understand how foreign governments use disinformation to try to disrupt what happens here internally. I mean, let's just go through these. Number one, it's wrong, in my view, whether it's legal or not, we can talk about. It is wrong to obtain and seek information from a foreign government to help you win an election here in America. Mm-hmm. Number two, he's just leaving out the fact that he doesn't understand the motivations of these countries. case. What if the information is incorrect, President Trump? Oh, Mr. President Trump, haven't you had that problem with the Steele dossier? Haven't you guys been talking about that maybe they were fed disinformation about you during that time, and now you want to say freely you want to take that information? It's just wrong, and I think it's dangerous, and he's not thinking about the second and third order consequences of what he just said.
It's incredibly striking, 6:59 p.m. on the East Coast as we wrap up this edition of The Beat with breaking news, reading the president's quote in full. I think maybe you do both when offered foreign help. You might want to listen. There's nothing wrong with listening. If somebody called from a country, say Norway, we have information on your opponent, I'd want to hear it, said the sitting president against the backdrop of the investigation into the potentially improper use of foreign information by his own campaign. That still remains, of course, a hot issue in the Congress. Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.